Good evening. Welcome back to Answers on Eschatology. My name is Dan Derry, and I'm the president of the Institute of Fulfilled Eschatology. Hey, we're in the middle of a study of Matthew 16, 27, and 28, and we've been demonstrating from this passage a first century second coming of Christ. Now, what I want to do in this video is I want to take another look at the theme or the element of the time when the saints receive the kingdom. And as we saw last video, according to Daniel 7, and Matthew 16, the saints would receive the kingdom at the coming of the Son of Man in judgment. But when we parallel Matthew 16 and Daniel 7 with Matthew 24 and 25, we see that the time when the saints received the kingdom at the coming of the Son of Man in judgment was the second coming of Christ at the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70. And that means that Matthew 16, 27, and 28, in fulfillment of Daniel 7, and the coming of the Son of Man when the saints received the kingdom, prophesied the second coming of Christ, which was fulfilled in the lifetime of Jesus' first century generation. After all, that's exactly what Matthew 16 says at face value, okay? I want to prove the same thing once again from another parable of Jesus, and that is in Luke 19, the parable of the nobleman who goes to the far country. Go there with me. Now, as we'll see in this parable, we have the exact same theme and framework that we saw in Daniel 7, Matthew 16, and Matthew 24 and 25. It is the coming of the Son of Man in judgment to establish his kingdom. And at that time, the saints receive the kingdom. And we'll see once again, based upon like Luke 19, the time that the saints received the kingdom was at the second coming of Christ, when he took vengeance on those who refused to have him reign over them. Let's take a look. Luke chapter 19, let's begin in verse 12. So he said, a nobleman went to a distant country to receive a kingdom for himself and then return. And he called 10 of his slaves and gave them 10 minas and said to them, do business with this until I come back or until I return. But his citizens hated him and sent a delegation after him, saying, we do not want this man to reign over us. Verse 15, when he returned after receiving the kingdom, he ordered that these slaves to whom he had given the money be called to him so that he might know what business they had done. I'll stop right there. As I'm sure you know, this parable of Jesus in Luke 19, as with many of his parables, are taken from real life stories or situations that his audience would have been familiar with. This particular story is taken from the real life kingdom that had been bestowed upon Herod Archelaus upon the death of his father Herod the Great. The story goes, Herod died, his son Archelaus inherited his kingdom, but according to the custom of the day, Rome being the supreme ruler of the world, even though Archelaus had received the kingdom, according to the testament of his father Herod, he had to go to a far country. He had to go to Rome to have this kingdom bestowed upon him by the emperor. Okay? And according to the story, Herod ruled in Jerusalem prior to his going to Rome for a short period of time. His rule was wicked and it was harsh. And upon his going to Rome to have the kingdom conferred upon him, the Jews in Jerusalem sent an embassy. They sent a delegation to Rome telling Caesar that we do not want this man to reign over us. Well, the delegation was not successful, and Herod Archelaus returned as ethnarch. He wasn't king, but he was ethnarch, and he was ruler over the Jews, and he executed punishment and justice on those who did not want him to reign over them. He slew them, and his rule was tyrannical. Now, based upon that story, Jesus tells this parable. He is the nobleman who went to the far country to receive his kingdom. Upon his ascension, he was seated upon the throne of David. This is the coronation of the king. And upon his ascension, he called his slaves, that is, his disciples, and he gave them minas, which represent the authority of the kingdom. And they were to steward and advance the rule and the reign of that kingdom on earth until he came. Are you with me? And in the meantime, there were many Jews in Jerusalem that rejected Christ as king. They rejected the gospel, and they sent an embassy, as it were, saying, we do not want this king, Jesus, to reign over us. Are you with me? And notice in verse 15, it says, when he returned, this is the return of Christ. This is not the ascension. The ascension is when he went to the far country to receive the initiation, the coronation of his kingdom. But when he returns, he calls those who had received the stewardship of the kingdom, he called those that they might give an account to what concerning what they had done with the authority that he had given them. And watch this. I'll get to that in a second. But go down, and at the same time, when he comes, when the nobleman returns, he says this in verse 27, but these enemies of mine, these are the Jews that did not want this king to reign over them, these enemies of mine who did not want me to reign over them, bring them here and slay them in my presence. Now watch this. We have the coming of the Son of Man, we have his return, and we have the judgment of those who did not want him to reign over them at the full establishment of the kingdom. We have the perfect thematic parallel and the framework that we see in Daniel 7, Matthew 16, and Matthew 24 and 25. It is at this time, according to Luke 19, that the saints receive the kingdom. Well, where do you get that? Well, I get that based upon the nobleman's response to his servants who had done business while he was away. Notice, it says in verse 15 and following, when he returned after receiving the kingdom, he ordered that these slaves to whom he had been given the money be called to him so that he might know what business they had done. The first appeared, saying, Master, your mina has made 10 minas. He said to him, well done, good slave. Because you have been faithful in a very little, you are to be in authority over 10 cities. The same is done with the one who gained 5 more minas. He was given authority over 5 cities. What is this? This is the time when the saints received the kingdom. They received a share in his rule and his reign. See, they had been given a stewardship. They had been given a responsibility to advance the kingdom. Those who were faithful, those who were faithful in advancing this kingdom and the gospel of the coming king, received the kingdom with him. They ruled and reigned with Christ upon his return. This is the time that the saints receive the kingdom. But according to the context, the time when the saints received the kingdom in Luke 19 was at the second coming of Christ, the return of the nobleman from the far country. And at that time, he judged and destroyed those who did not want him to reign over them. This was the coming of the Lord in AD 70 to destroy the Jews and Jerusalem, those wicked slaves who have no part in the kingdom or the reign of the king. This is perfectly parallel with Matthew 16 and Daniel chapter 7. According to Daniel 7 and Matthew 16, 27 and 28, the coming of the Son of Man takes place when the saints receive the kingdom. But the coming of the Son of Man, when the saints receive the kingdom, was the second coming of Christ in Luke 19. Therefore, Matthew 16, 27, 28 prophesied the second coming of Christ. And at that time, the saints received the kingdom, and those who had refused the king and his reign were judged and destroyed. And this took place at the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70. Not in our future, not tomorrow, not 2,000 years from now, or any time post AD 70. It took place in the first century generation, just like Jesus promised. Verily I say unto you, there are some of those who are standing here who will not taste death till they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. And when he came in his kingdom, he rewarded those saints who were faithful with the authority and the stewardship of that kingdom. We'll see you next time on Answers on Eschatology. Bye for now.